Welcome back, everyone. Let's go ahead and talk about one of the most impressive phones that ever came out, in my opinion. It's one of the OG phones. It's really one of those perfect Androids of that time. And even though it wasn't the most perfect phone in the world as of this point, I still think it's a beautiful phone, and I am still in love with this device for sure. Now, this specific phone is the Nexus 5, one of the most popular and probably one of the most iconic phones of all time as well. Now, this phone came out in 2013, so it obviously isn't, the most up-to-date phone. It's way older than you would think. And to be honest, I think I got my first Android phone around this time, my Nexus 5, or one of my first, beautiful phones, which was the Nexus 4. That was one of my favorite phones of all time. I loved it a lot. And the Nexus 5 was the successor, but a lot of people said that this phone was actually a downgrade to the Nexus 4, which I found pretty impressive. Now, on the front, the Nexus 5 had almost a 5-inch display. It was 4.95 inches, so not quite there, but still fairly close. And you had, obviously, a 1080p panel of that time. Before it was a 720p on the Nexus 4. This one did end up going to 1080p, which was really, really nice. And here's the thing with the Nexus 5. When it came out, it wasn't a $1,000 phone. It was like a sub $500 phone in a lot of places. And this thing was supposed to be that budget, that flagship killer that OnePlus kind of was noted for. This was, and the Nexus 4 even, were those flagship killers at that time. And again, this was before like the $1,000 phones and all that stuff. This was probably around like $600, $700 phones. This was back when you could buy a phone on contract and like get it for free and stuff. So that was kind of cool in my opinion. Now, you do have like that speaker grill up top, which, I loved. It looked like a front-facing camera that was right in the middle, but the camera was actually onto the left side. And you had the micro USB port on the bottom, headphone jack and everything. And on the back, you had that plastic back as well. And I love the back of this phone. I still think it's one of the most best-looking, minimalistic phones of all time. And that camera sensor as well just looks so beautiful. And when you look at this phone and you look at the Pixel 5, in my opinion, this phone looks better in so many ways. Even though the bezels are pretty big and everything, at that time, this was kind of a breakthrough, The Nexus 4 had massive bezels, and 2013 was around the same year that the iPhone 5S came out. So when you look at the iPhone 5S and you look at the Nexus 5, this thing was a massive phone. And it's funny holding this device now and kind of messing with it. It obviously feels very plasticky, The Nexus 4 felt extremely premium because of the glass on the back. This one felt very plasticky, had a lot of creaking going on. I'm not a huge fan of the, kind of the step down that, LG did at the time or Google did at the time, but I still think it was a perfect phone because of all the features in the stock Android. Now, the camera on the back had a single 8 megapixel sensor, nothing super crazy. 1080p on the back, you had a 1.3 megapixel front-facing camera, and I'm definitely going to tell you that Nexus at this point were not known for their cameras, and to be honest, it was probably one of the worst things about picking up these phones. I had the Nexus 4 for, I think, over 2 years, and I never really cared about the camera because I didn't really care too much at the time, but looking back and looking at the photos that I took of that time, they were in horrible quality, and I do kind of wish I had a better phone at the time so that I can kind of look at those photos a little bit better, but I do think, it's not that big of a deal, and we kind of get used to it, and we can take better photos now. But the Nexus 5, compared to my Nexus 4, had a better camera, but it really wasn't that much better, and the iPhone 5S definitely had a better camera of that year. Even the Galaxy, which I think was the Galaxy S4 at the time, had a better camera as well. So I think the Nexus 5 was a great phone, but the camera definitely was not that great. And it wasn't until like the phones after this, which was the Nexus 6P, after the Nexus 6, that was actually the only other phone that was pretty decent in terms of camera, but that one was also a flop because of the whole entire boot loop and all that stuff. So that pretty much covers it up in a camera standpoint. Now, the best thing about this phone, if you couldn't tell, was the software. This phone's software was so perfect in so many different ways. It started off with Android 4.4 and ended on Android 6.0, which was Marshmallow. Now, obviously, that's an outdated version of Android. Nobody should be using that anymore. But to be honest, when I look at Android Marshmallow and I look at, the newer Androids, the only thing that's changed is the nav bar at the bottom. We don't have a nav bar anymore like we did before. Other than that, there's still a lot of similarities, which I think is okay for the most part. It's not that big of a deal. Now, here's the thing with the Pixel 5. This thing, the ROM community behind it is so extremely large still that almost every single version of Android that comes out in terms of official version, there's almost always a custom ROM behind it that is still supported on the Nexus 5. This is still one of the highest supported phones of all time. And to be honest, once Android 12 comes out, there's going to be a custom ROM out for this phone probably sooner than later. It's almost always all of the Nexus devices end up getting the custom ROMs first because it's just so easy to flash a phone on it. It's just so easy. So I am curious to see what, the Pixel 5 custom ROMs are going to look like, in the future. But this device for that time was actually pretty cool, and I'm a humongous fan of those things for sure. Now the battery life was another one of those things that, wasn't that great. 2300 milliamp hour battery. It was one of the bigger complaints I heard at that time, even though it was stock Android. But I did hear about some people able to, essentially mod their Nexus 5, and they were able to put an LG G2 battery inside of the Nexus 5, which was super crazy too. The LG G2 I think had like a 3000 milliamp hour battery, and that was also another phone I had. I had that for about 2 years as well before I switched. That was the last Android phone I had before I switched over to, iOS. And I love that phone too. I custom ROM'd it, and the G2 battery could have fit in the Nexus 5 apparently, which is super crazy. I never tried it, but that was something that could have been done. So I think overall I'm a fan of the Nexus 5. The battery wasn't that great, but everything else about it was pretty good. Now ending it off with the performance, and this thing at that time had that Qualcomm Snapdragon 800 chipset, quad-core CPU, Adreno 330 GPU, and 2 different models with 2 gigs of RAM. Now the top tier model had 32 gigs of storage. Now how crazy is that nowadays that is like not even the base model. The iPhone 12 Pros have 128. The iPhone 12s have 64 for base models. This one at that time had 32 for the max storage. That's actually pretty crazy. Now I think in terms of a performance standpoint, obviously it's not that great of a performing phone anymore. And to be honest, even when I had it like 5 years ago, when this thing was only like 3 or 4 years old, it was pretty much on its last leg in terms of me not custom ROMing it or anything. No custom kernels. It was essentially just a raw phone as it of itself, and it was overheating all the time. I think I've had like 4 or 5 Nexus 5s, at least 4 that I know of, that I actually own as a personal device. That I actually owned, I never used them as a personal device, but I, owned them. I would make videos about them, I think, early on. And, I'm not a humongous fan of the Nexus 5 in terms of a performance standpoint, mostly because of the overheating. But once you get over that, it's actually a pretty fair phone. I think it feels pretty good. It performs fairly good. And the stock Android really helps it out a lot. I think the 800 was the top tier Snapdragon processor of that year, so it wasn't like the G chipset like we have now. So I think that's a good thing. I love seeing that kind of stuff. But this phone at that point, in terms of that performance, dude, it's not a bad performing phone. And because this thing gave you that type of performance at a much lower level, at a much lower price tag, that's another plus point for this device as well. And I think when you get a phone like this, you're going to be set, in terms of performance standpoint at that time. Like I mentioned, it's not really worth it anymore. But at that moment, when you looked at, the iPhone 5S that cost way more and the Galaxy S4 that cost way more, I mean, this thing for that type of performance was actually a pretty decent thing. And I'm actually a fan of that, like I mentioned before. So I think from a performance standpoint, I'm happy with it. I don't think it's that big of a deal. It could have been better, yes, but I think where it's at now, it's not that big of a deal, and I'm actually more happy with it than not. So in terms of that pretty much covers it up there. And to kind of sum up this video and answer the question, is this phone still worth it in 2021? Well, I will say completely not. This phone is not worth it anymore, not even a little bit. If you're planning on using this phone as an everyday phone, please avoid it. It is not worth it at all. I'm not, telling you guys to do it, and I'm not going to be held liable if you end up doing it. But this is what I'll tell you, I think this phone is still, a legendary phone in so many different ways. I think this phone had a lot going for it at that time, although it really doesn't have too much going for it anymore. I think it's a great phone in the historical artifact that is Android. I think Android killed it in so many different ways, and I think I'm super happy with this phone still. Now, like I mentioned, there were lots of issues, there were lots of little problems here and there, boot loops and all this stuff, but I think when this phone is, done for it, it's going to be known as a device that really kind of helped shape, Google into becoming that, flagship killer, which it kind of ended up not becoming anymore. I think ever since the Nexus 6, it really kind of ended up changing up, but this was the last Android, in my opinion, from Google that really changed things up for sure. I think since the Pixel 4a. So that pretty much covers it up. If you guys have any other questions, let me know in the comment section below. Hit the like button, that would mean so much, but definitely hit that subscribe button. More importantly than everything else, I love every single one of you guys. Hopefully I'll catch you guys in the next video. Peace out till then.